The Gilded Stranger. The rain had not ceased for 3 days. It fell in slender ribbons upon the northern moors, turning the roads into slick veins of mud and shadow. Inside a rickety carriage that lurched and groaned against the storm, Elara Whitmore pressed her gloved hands together for warmth. The chill found every seam of her dress, seeping into her bones until she could scarcely remember the warmth of a hearth. "Nearly there, miss," called the driver, muffled beneath his soaked hat. "Vale Manor's just beyond the ridge." Elara lifted the curtain. Through the rain-smeared glass, she caught her first glimpse of the estate that would change her life. It rose from the mist like something conjured from a fever dream. Towers of blackened stone, gilded spires catching the occasional flash of lightning, and windows that gleamed like 100 watchful eyes. It was neither welcoming nor wholly uninviting. It was magnificent, in the way that a storm at sea was magnificent, vast, untamed, and dangerous. Her breath fogged the window. "So this is where my new life begins," she murmured. When the carriage finally halted before the great doors, a servant in livery rushed forward with an umbrella so large it could have sheltered a family. Elara stepped down carefully, boots sinking slightly into the wet gravel. "Miss Whitmore?" asked the servant, bowing slightly. "Lady Evangeline Vale awaits you in the east drawing-room. This way, if you please." Elara nodded, clutching her small valise. "Thank you." They passed beneath an archway, carved with gilded vines and angels, the light of countless candles glimmering along the corridors. Every inch of Vale Manor spoke of wealth beyond imagination. Velvet draperies, portraits in gilded frames, marble staircases that coiled upward like white serpents. Yet beneath it all lingered something darker, an emptiness that echoed through the vast halls. As they neared the drawing-room, she heard laughter, delicate, melodic, and slightly too loud. Lady Evangeline Vale was as she had been described in the letters, a woman of startling beauty, her golden hair arranged in intricate braids, her gown shimmering like spun moonlight. "Miss Whitmore!" she exclaimed, rising gracefully from her chaise. "At last! You must be frozen through! Do come to the fire!" Elara curtsied, lowering her eyes. "My lady, it is an honour to serve you." "Oh, nonsense!" Evangeline said, waving a jewelled hand. "You're here to keep me company, not to bow. My brother insists I mustn't be alone during the season, though he never attends a single ball himself. You'll find him quite impossible." Elara smiled politely, unsure whether to agree or disagree. "Your brother, Lord Vale, is he at home, my lady?" Evangeline's smile flickered. "He is always at home, though one rarely sees him. Adrian is different." She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Brilliant, yes, but touched by solitude. He built factories, ships, railways, and that dreadful palace on the hill. You've seen it, I expect." Elara nodded. "From the carriage. It's terrifying," Evangeline supplied, with a laugh that did not quite hide her unease. "He calls it his monument to progress. I call it his obsession." Before Elara could reply, the door opened behind them, quietly, but with a presence that stilled the air. The servant bowed deeply. "My lord?" Evangeline's posture straightened. "Speak of the devil," she murmured. Elara turned. Lord Adrian Vale stood in the doorway, tall, severe, and shadowed by the light of the fire behind him. His dark hair was slick with rain, his coat unbuttoned to reveal the hint of a black waistcoat embroidered in gold. His eyes, grey as storm water, rested on Elara, with a gaze that was both measured and searching. For a moment, Neither spoke. Then he said, voice low and deliberate, "You are Miss Whitmore." Alara inclined her head. "Yes, my lord. I've been engaged as Lady Evangeline's companion." A flicker, the faintest smile. A companion. To keep her from dying of boredom, I suppose. Evangeline rolled her eyes. "You make me sound feeble, Adrian." "You make yourself sound so," he replied, still watching Alara. "And Miss Whitmore? Do you find the rain agreeable?" Caught off guard, she answered honestly. "It depends, my lord. Some rains are gentle, others reveal what the earth tries to hide." Something like amusement glinted in his eyes. "An uncommon observation." Evangeline exhaled dramatically. "Adrian, must you interrogate everyone I hire?" He ignored her, stepping closer. "From where do you come, Miss Whitmore?" "From Durham, my lord. My father was a schoolmaster." "Was? He passed 2 winters ago." "I see." His gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "Then the world has not been kind." Alara met his eyes, an act she would later realize few dared. "The world seldom is, my lord, but we endure." For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, taut and electric. The fire crackled. Rain struck the windows. Somewhere in the manor, a clock chimed 6. Evangeline broke the spell with a forced laugh. "Really, Adrian, you make her sound like a philosopher." He turned away at last, his expression unreadable. "Philosophy thrives in rainstorms," he said quietly, and strode from the room. Evangeline sighed. "You see what I mean? He can't simply greet someone like a normal man." But Alara's mind was elsewhere. She felt a strange, inexplicable tremor within her, not of fear, nor admiration, but something more dangerous. Curiosity. That night, she was shown to her chamber, a modest room overlooking the eastern gardens. The rain had lessened to a whisper. From her window, Alara could see a distant glimmer beyond the forest, faint lights flickering upon the hill. "The palace," she whispered. It shimmered faintly, its golden domes reflecting the moonlight through the mist. Even from afar, it seemed unreal, like a dream one might wake from too soon. A palace built by a man who did not smile, a man whose gaze unsettled her more than any storm. As she closed the curtains and lay upon the unfamiliar bed, Alara could not shake the feeling that the rain had followed her inside. Soft, secret and filled with warning. And somewhere within the manor, in a study lined with dark wood and maps of his empire, Lord Adrian Vale stood by the window, staring into the same storm. He did not know why the arrival of a simple girl from Durham had disturbed the calm order of his solitude. But he knew this much. The rain had brought more than a visitor. It had brought change. The Palace of Gold. The days that followed Alara's arrival passed like a strange dream, a rhythm of morning letters, piano lessons, and afternoon walks through the dripping gardens of Vale Manor. Lady Evangeline delighted in gossip and laughter, but it was her brother's shadow that lingered over every hour. Lord Adrian Vale was seldom seen, though his presence was everywhere, in the whisper of servants, in the sound of distant hammering from the hills, and in the scent of smoke that drifted from his factories across the moors. He was the silent god of this domain, shaping the world from behind closed doors. Yet, on the 5th day, he summoned her. The butler, stern and grey, appeared as she finished reading to Evangeline. "Miss Whitmore," he intoned, "Lord Vale requests your company in the carriage-house at once." Evangeline looked up sharply. "My brother, whatever for?" "I was not informed, my lady." Alara rose, smoothing her modest blue gown. "Shall I go, my lady?" Evangeline waved a hand, half curious, half anxious. "If he asks, you must." But do tell me afterward if he's building another one of his infernal machines." The butler led her through the long glass corridor toward the outer courtyard. The rain had ceased, leaving the air clean and pale with morning mist. When the great doors opened, Alara found Lord Vale waiting beside a gleaming black carriage, a work of craftsmanship that seemed more art than vehicle. "Miss Whitmore?" he greeted, his voice cool but not unkind. "I trust you are settling in." "I am, my lord," she replied, curtsying. "The manner is most remarkable." He studied her for a moment. Remarkable. An interesting word for something half alive. Then, abruptly, "Come, I wish to show you something." She hesitated. "Me, my lord?" "Yes, unless you are otherwise engaged." "No, my lord," she said quickly, stepping forward. The carriage rolled out of the gates, wheels whispering against the damp earth. They rode in silence at first, the only sound the rhythmic beat of hooves. Alara kept her hands folded in her lap, stealing glances at him when she dared. Lord Vale's profile was sharp, his expression distant, as if he were measuring invisible equations behind the grey of his eyes. The world outside changed as they climbed higher into the hills, the moors stretching wide and lonely, until at last something golden broke through the fog. Alara gasped. The palace of gold rose before them, colossal, gleaming, and utterly unreal. Its domes and columns were plated in pure gilt, its archways inlaid with crystal. Even under the dim winter sun, it shimmered like fire frozen in stone. The sight stole her breath. "My lord," she whispered, "it's impossible." He looked at her then, not with pride, but with the calm of someone who had already lived this moment 1,000 times in his mind. "Nothing is impossible, Miss Whitmore. Only unfinished." As they stepped out, her boots clicked against marble steps veined with gold. The vast doors swung open to reveal a hall that stretched farther than her eyes could follow. Every wall covered in murals of sunrise and flame, every chandelier dripping light like honey. "What is this place?" she asked softly. He turned toward her, the faintest smile touching his lips. "My vision, my legacy. I began it 3 years ago, a monument to the empire we are building, to progress, to endurance." "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Then, almost involuntarily, "and terribly lonely." He looked at her sharply. "Lonely? Yes, my lord. It feels as though it waits for something, or someone, to make it real." Adrian's gaze lingered on her face. "Few would dare speak to me so plainly." She met his eyes. "Then few have spoken truthfully, my lord." A long silence passed between them, filled with the sound of echoing footsteps and the distant toll of the wind through the towers. He walked ahead, motioning for her to follow. "I did not bring you here to flatter me, Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "You see the palace's grandeur, yes, but grandeur alone is empty. It requires purpose, something human, something alive." Alara looked around. "Then you mean to fill it? In time. Artists, architects, thinkers. A place where creation itself is worshipped." But he stopped beside a vast window, looking out toward the horizon. "Beauty must be shaped, Miss Whitmore. Left unchecked, it decays." Alara studied his reflection in the glass. "And who decides what form beauty should take?" He turned toward her slowly. "I do." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of command. Still, she saw something in him that unsettled her, not arrogance, but hunger. A man chasing perfection because he could not bear imperfection within himself. He gestured toward a high balcony. "Come." The wind struck cold as they stepped outside. From there, the view was breathtaking. The valley below, Vale Manor distant like a toy house, the river cutting silver through the green. The palaces, Domes gleamed in the light, endless and proud. "Do you see now?" he asked quietly. "This is the future. Steel and gold, the old world fading into the new." Alara wrapped her shawl tighter. "And where do you stand in it, my lord? As its ruler or its prisoner?" He looked at her sharply again, but this time his tone softened. "You are fond of dangerous questions." "Only the ones that deserve answers." He smiled then, truly smiled, and for a moment she saw the man beneath the myth. "Perhaps that is why I brought you here." Her heart quickened. "To ask dangerous questions?" "To remind me they exist," he said, his voice low. "I have built everything that can be touched, Miss Whitmore. Yet something remains beyond reach." The words lingered in the air, intimate, uncertain. Then, as quickly as the moment formed, he turned away. "Come, I'll have you returned before luncheon. My sister frets when her companion disappears." They descended the golden stairs in silence. But Alara felt changed, as if the palace had whispered something only she could hear. When the carriage carried them back toward the manor, she glanced once more over her shoulder. The palace of gold shone behind them, stark against the grey horizon. Its towers pierced the clouds like spears of light, radiant, unyielding. And as the wind tugged through the open window, she thought she heard the faintest echo in the distance, not of machinery, but of something softer. A heartbeat, the pulse of a dream too vast for one man to bear alone. That night, she dreamed of walking through the palace halls barefoot, her hands trailing over the gilded walls. The gold was warm beneath her fingers like sunlight trapped in metal, and somewhere in the dream she heard his voice. "If beauty becomes a prison, Miss Whitmore, would you still call it paradise?" When she woke, her heart was still racing. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world gleamed, reborn, and far away on the hill, the golden palace caught the dawn like a crown. The portrait and the promise. "Adrian is commissioning a portrait gallery," she said one afternoon, sipping tea by the sunroom window. "He wishes to immortalize the family name, as if the world has not already had enough of his likeness. But he asked me to suggest the first subject." Alara smiled faintly. "And who did you suggest, my lady?" Evangeline's eyes sparkled. "Why, you, of course." Alara nearly dropped her cup. "Me? Why not?" Evangeline laughed, reclining against her cushions. "You have the look painters adore. That pale, thoughtful face, the kind that makes men write poetry about heartbreak." "My lady, surely your brother would never—" "Oh, my dear, you underestimate him," Evangeline interrupted, twirling her fan. "When Adrian is intrigued, he cannot resist a challenge. He has been speaking of you for days, though heaven knows he pretends not to. You should see the way he listens when you enter a room." Alara felt warmth rise in her cheeks. "I assure you, my lady, I've given him no reason." "Reason?" Evangeline laughed again. "My brother needs none. He's been buried in his empire for so long that the mere sight of sincerity startles him." Alara tried to laugh it off, but the words stayed with her. That evening, as she crossed the marble corridor, she nearly collided with Lord Vale himself. "My lord, forgive me," she stammered. He steadied her with one gloved hand, his touch brief but grounding. "No harm done," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, "My sister tells me she has volunteered you for my painter's next commission." She looked up. "I told her it was unnecessary." "And yet," he said, voice low, "I find I do not mind." Her pulse quickened. "You wish for me to sit?" He regarded her with a curious intensity. "The artist claims he can only capture truth if he sees it. I wonder if that is possible." She frowned slightly. "Truth, my lord. Yes, His gaze softened. "And I think you might know something of it." Before she could reply, he gestured toward the grand staircase. "Tomorrow, at 11, the studio in the West Wing." The next morning dawned cold and bright, the moors glittering with frost. Elara entered the studio with hesitant steps. Sunlight poured through tall arched windows, striking against canvases half finished, portraits of lords, soldiers, and queens whose eyes followed her as she moved. At the far end of the room stood Lord Vale and the painter, a man in spectacles and an ink-stained waistcoat. He bowed respectfully. "Miss Whitmore, if you would take your place by the window, please." Elara sat upon a carved chair, hands folded in her lap. The painter adjusted his brushes, while Adrian observed in silence, his expression unreadable. Hours passed in quiet concentration. The only sounds were the scratch of bristles against canvas, the creak of the easel, and the occasional rustle of Elara's skirts. Yet every now and then she felt his gaze upon her, steady, unblinking. When at last the painter paused to clean his brushes, Adrian stepped closer, examining the half-finished portrait. "You have captured her likeness," he said softly, "but not her light." The painter blinked. "My lord?" "She is not porcelain," Adrian said, still watching Elara. "She burns, though she hides it. Paint that." Elara's breath caught. "My lord." He turned to her, eyes dark. "Do you disagree?" She swallowed. I think perhaps we all hide what burns within us." His mouth curved faintly. "Yes, and sometimes it is what consumes us in the end." The painter coughed delicately. "My lord, perhaps if Miss Whitmore would return tomorrow." Adrian nodded absently. "Yes, tomorrow, at the same hour." For the next fortnight, Elara returned each morning. And each morning, Lord Vale was there. He seldom spoke, yet his presence filled the room like an unseen tide. Sometimes he would stand by the window, lost in thought. Other times he would move closer, his voice a low murmur as he discussed art and light and the strange cruelty of memory. It was during one such sitting that he asked, "Do you ever think of what you've lost?" Elara hesitated. "Every day, my lord." "Then why do you not grieve?" She looked up at him, startled. "Who says I do not?" His expression softened. "Because you smile, and I have learned that the deepest wounds rarely allow it." She drew a slow breath. "Perhaps smiling is my rebellion." He regarded her in silence. "Then rebellion becomes you." That evening, she found herself alone in the library. The room smelled of leather and dust, lit only by the glow of the fire. She stood before the shelves, tracing the spines of books, volumes of philosophy, history, poetry. When she turned, she found him there. "My lord," she whispered, startled, "I didn't hear you enter." "I wasn't sure I should." He stepped closer, his eyes catching the firelight. "You haunt my thoughts, Miss Whitmore." Her heart thudded. "That is not my intention." "Nor is it mine," he said quietly. "Yet here we are." Silence stretched between them. The fire cracked. A soft wind sighed against the windows. Elara lowered her gaze. "I am your sister's companion, my lord, nothing more." He took another step. "And yet you speak to me as no one else dares. You see me, not the title, not the wealth, me." "You mistake politeness for perception," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "No, I mistake nothing." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a delicate gold pendant, shaped like a flame. "Consider this a token," he said, "for the portrait." Elara shook her head. "I cannot accept such a gift." "You can," he said, his tone brooking no refusal. "And you will." Her fingers trembled as she closed the box. "Why me, my lord? Why any of this?" Adrian looked at her for a long, aching moment. "Because for the first time in years, I have built something I do not wish to own." Then he turned and left her standing in the flickering firelight, the pendant warm in her palm. The portrait was finished 2 days later. When the painter unveiled it, even Evangeline fell silent. It was not a picture of a servant or a muse. It was something deeper. Elara stood beside the window, her gaze lifted toward the light, her expression filled with quiet strength. The golden pendant gleamed at her throat. "It's extraordinary," Evangeline whispered. "She looks alive." Adrian said nothing. He only nodded once, as if seeing not the painting but the truth it revealed. After the painter departed, he spoke softly to Elara. "He captured you." She smiled faintly. "You told him to." "I told him to find your light," he corrected. "He merely followed it." Their eyes met, and in that instant something unspoken passed between them, as fragile as glass and just as dangerous. That night, as the wind howled across the moors, Elara sat by her window, the pendant glinting in the candlelight. She turned it over in her hand and discovered a small inscription upon the back. "For what is built in gold must one day learn to bleed." She stared at it for a long time, unease prickling her skin. And somewhere in the dark corridors below, Lord Adrian Vale stood alone before her portrait, staring at the painted flame that now burned brighter than all his gilded dreams. The wedding that should never have been winter had come early to Vale Manor. The trees along the moor stood bare, their branches trembling against a sky the colour of smoke. In the golden palace on the hill, fires burned day and night, though the air within felt no warmer than the frost outside. It was there that Elara returned after a week's absence, summoned by a letter written in Lord Vale's sharp, precise hand. "Come to the palace. There are matters we must discuss." She told herself it was nothing, perhaps another commission, another strange request. Yet, as her carriage climbed the winding road, she could not still the quick beat of her heart. The palace of gold loomed like a dream, half frozen in time. Its towers glittered through the snowlight, silent and waiting. Servants met her at the entrance, their faces unreadable. They led her through corridors where every surface gleamed, yet the air was heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. When she entered the grand hall, Adrian Vale was already there, standing before the great hearth, his dark coat stark against the gilded stone. "My lord," she said quietly, curtsying, "you wished to see me." He turned. His face was pale, drawn. He had not shaved, and the faint shadow along his jaw only made him look more haunted. "You came," he said simply. "I received your letter." "I did not think you would." Elara studied him. "Why would I not? Because I wronged you." His voice was low, almost hoarse. "I should have let you leave when I began to see what this was becoming." "What this is?" she asked softly. He stepped closer, the firelight catching in his eyes. "A chain, Miss Whitmore, a chain of my own making." Elara's pulse quickened. "Then break it." "I cannot," he said, "because it binds me to you." For a long moment, silence filled the vast hall, a silence so complete that the crackle of the fire sounded like thunder. "My lord," she said at last, "whatever affection you imagine, do not call it imagination," he interrupted, his voice rough. "You think I do not know myself, that I mistake hunger for love. I know exactly what I feel, and it terrifies me." Elara drew back. "Then you must master it." "I tried," he said, "and I failed." He reached into his coat, pulling out a folded paper, sealed with black wax. "My solicitor drew this yesterday. It is a marriage contract." She stared at it as if it were a blade. "My lord, listen," he said, his tone hardening, as though to armour himself against his own weakness. "You will be mistress of this estate. I will make you the most powerful woman in this county. You will never want for anything again." Elara's voice shook. "And what of your sister? Of your peers? They will destroy you for it." "Let them try," he said. "I built this empire from nothing. They will kneel before the woman I choose." She stepped back, trembling. "You cannot mean this." "I do." His grey eyes burned. "Say yes, and I will build a world for you. Gold, light, everything you have ever been denied." Elara's heart ached. "And if I say no?" He was silent for a long time. Then, softly, "Then the palace remains empty, and so do I." Tears stung her eyes. "You don't love me, Adrian. You love the reflection of yourself you see in me." He flinched, as if struck, and then, with quiet defiance, said, "Then let me live within that reflection. It is the only beauty I understand." They were married a month later. The wedding was small, scandalously private. No invitations, no nobles, only a priest, a handful of servants, and the golden walls that gleamed like witnesses to a sin too exquisite to name. Evangeline did not attend. Her carriage left the manor 2 nights before, and no one had seen her since. Elara wore a gown of ivory silk, her hair crowned with pale lilies. Adrian waited for her at the altar, a figure carved from stone, his expression unreadable. As she approached, she caught the faintest tremor in his hands. "Do you take this man?" asked the priest. Her voice was barely audible. "I do." "And do you take this woman?" Adrian's gaze did not waver. "I do." The words hung in the air like a sentence passed. When their lips met, the candles flickered, as though the flame itself recoiled from the vow. That night, as the newlyweds dined in the Golden Hall, Elara could not bring herself to eat. The vast table stretched between them like a battlefield. She felt every tick of the clock, every whisper of wind beyond the gilded glass. At last she said, "You've won your prize, my lord. Are you content?" Adrian set down his glass. "Do you think this is victory? You have everything you wanted." He leaned forward, voice low, "Accept peace." She looked at him, her own anger flickering to life. "You built a palace for it." "Yes," he said bitterly, "and turned it into my prison." Her heart caught at the words, the sudden honesty in them. "Then perhaps," she said, "you should learn what it feels like to be the one inside the cage." He stared at her, and something in his expression changed. A glint of challenge, of admiration, of fear. "You would dare?" he whispered. She rose, the candlelight glinting off her wedding ring. "I already have." Days turned into weeks. The Golden Palace became a world unto itself, filled with art, luxury, and silence. Servants moved like ghosts. Adrian's temper grew shorter, his sleepless nights longer. He would disappear into his study for hours, emerging hollow-eyed, his hands stained with ink. Elara, once quiet, grew colder, her voice edged with steel, her smile like glass. She walked the corridors as though they belonged to her. She spoke to the servants gently, earned their trust. She began to understand how to rule this place, not as his possession, but as its heart. It was said among the staff that the lady of the palace did not sleep in her husband's chambers, that she spent her nights by the great east window, watching the snow fall over the valley. They said Lord Vale began to speak less, that his laughter, rare to begin with, vanished altogether, and yet, when he looked at her, there was still that same fire, fierce, desperate, endless. One evening, she found him in the great hall, staring at her portrait, the one that had begun it all. The light flickered across his face, and for the first time She saw how tired he truly was. "You've made your point," he said quietly. "The palace is yours. I am yours. Will that satisfy you?" Elara stepped beside him, her voice soft. "You asked for a queen, Adrian. You never imagined she'd learn to rule." He smiled faintly, the ghost of a smile. "Then teach me." Her eyes softened. "You wouldn't survive the lesson." The fire crackled, golden light washing over the marble floor. Two silhouettes stood before it, husband and wife, creator and creation, builder and muse. And though the palace shimmered with impossible beauty, it had already begun to darken from within. The slow corrosion of love turned to pride, devotion twisted into defiance. Neither of them yet knew how far it would fall, but the walls already did. The Palace of Gold was beginning to turn to dust. The Queen of a Golden Cage. The first spring after their marriage came in timidly. Soft rain instead of snow, mist instead of frost. But inside the Palace of Gold, the air remained cold, still, and heavy with unspoken truths. Elara had changed. Gone was the uncertain young woman who once entered this estate as a companion. The months of silence, the careful observation of servants, the endless hours among gilded halls had reshaped her into something sharper, elegant, composed, untouchable. She now moved through the palace like its sovereign. Every morning she dressed not as a lord's wife, but as a ruler. Silks of pale blue, ivory, or gold, hair wound in intricate braids, eyes veiled with quiet authority. The servants bowed to her, even the steward, once loyal only to Adrian, now awaited her word before he acted. The change had not been planned. It had simply happened. The palace itself had chosen its queen. Adrian watched this transformation with both pride and dread. He admired her grace, her composure, the power she commanded, and yet it frightened him. He had built this golden world for her, thinking it would make her happy, thinking it would bind her to him. But the more she grew into it, the more he felt himself disappearing from it. At first, he tried to resist the thought. He bought her gifts, jewels from Vienna, paintings from Florence, silk from the East. She accepted them politely, thanked him with that same quiet smile, but her eyes never softened. Then he tried tenderness. He would find her in the garden, offer his arm, speak gently of his plans for the estate. She would listen, nod, and change the subject to something she could control. The new servants, the upcoming charity ball, the repairs she'd ordered without his permission. Finally, he tried anger. That, too, failed. One evening, as the sun sank behind the moors, he found her standing on the balcony, overlooking the valley. The wind lifted her hair, the last light of day catching in the gold embroidery of her gown. "You've called another council without me," he said quietly behind her. She didn't turn. "Someone had to. The tenants' accounts were 3 weeks overdue. That is my duty. Then why wasn't it done?" Her tone was calm even. That hurt him more than any insult. "Elara," he exhaled sharply, "do you despise me?" "No," she said after a pause. "I pity you." He froze. "Pity me?" "Yes." She turned then, her eyes dark with restrained fury. "You built this palace to prove you were more than the men who mocked your name. You built it to own something, as someone, that would never leave you. But all you've done is trap yourself in it." He stepped forward, his voice rising. "You speak as though you've never known hunger, or cold, or the shame of begging for respect." "I have known worse," she said. "I have known the silence of being unseen. You changed that. For that, I was grateful. But now—" She gestured to the glittering expanse around them. Now I see that your love is not freedom. It is possession." He stared at her, stunned. "You think I'm your captor? Aren't you?" Something inside him broke. "Then why stay?" Her gaze softened, almost pitying. "Because I mean to free myself properly. And when I do, you'll never own another thing again." The wind caught her words and carried them across the moors. A vow whispered into dusk. The weeks that followed were a quiet war. Elara began to take charge of every corner of the estate. She reorganized the servants, dismissed the ones who spied too freely, and replaced them with loyal hands. She reopened the old foundry Adrian had closed, hiring women and children from the nearby village to work for fair wages. She restored the chapel. She hosted small gatherings, poets, painters, and reformists who had long been denied entry to the manor's gates. For the first time, laughter returned to the palace, though it was hers, not his. Adrian's empire, once built upon steel and trade, began to shift beneath him. His factories faltered. His advisers whispered that his wife's charitable meddling was bleeding the coffers. He dismissed the claims with forced calm, but at night he sat awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how the empire he had built for her had become her weapon. He began drinking again, a habit he'd buried years before. The staff grew wary of him. The more he tried to assert control, the more he seemed like a stranger in his own home. One night, he returned early from London, unannounced. He found Elara in the music room, the firelight dancing over the piano keys. She was alone, playing a haunting melody that filled the golden walls with something both sorrowful and defiant. When she saw him, she did not stop. Her fingers moved as though guided by some ghostly will. He approached, standing behind her. "Elara," he said, his voice quiet but unsteady. "Play something happier." She didn't answer. "Elara." Her hands stilled. "Does happiness obey command, my lord?" He exhaled sharply, circling to face her. "Must everything be a battle between us?" "Only because you made it so." He knelt beside her, desperation cracking through the surface of his calm. "Tell me what you want from me." She met his gaze. "Freedom. And if I can't give it, then I will take it." The next morning, Adrian announced he was leaving for London indefinitely to oversee new contracts. Elara said nothing, only nodded. But when his carriage vanished down the road, she went to his study and locked the door. She sat at his desk, the empire of ledgers and correspondence spread before her. She began to read, and what she found both astonished and sickened her. The gold that built this palace had been forged in blood, in the sweat of labourers underpaid, in contracts signed through coercion, in debts Adrian had used to crush his rivals. Her palace, her silks, her very comfort, all of it had been born from ruin. When Adrian returned 2 weeks later, he found the study bare of half its documents. Elara stood by the window, waiting. "What have you done?" he demanded. "What you would not," she replied coldly. "I paid the debts you never repaid, released the men you kept in servitude, sold your northern shares to free their villages. You've destroyed everything I built." "I've cleansed it," she said. "I will not live in a palace made of others' suffering." He was trembling now, not from rage, but from heartbreak. "You've taken my life's work and burned it for your own virtue." "No, Adrian." Her voice softened, but there was no pity in it. "I've taken your prison and made it my home." That night, thunder rolled over the moors. The storm broke like a confession, long withheld. Rain hammered against the golden walls, lightning shattering the sky. Adrian wandered the halls alone, half mad with grief. He called her name once, twice, then stopped, for he knew she would not come. In her chamber, Elara watched the storm with calm eyes. The palace was trembling. The man she once pitied was unravelling before her, but she did not gloat. She only whispered into the thunder, "He built me a palace of gold, and I turned it into his prison." By dawn the storm had passed, but nothing of the world they'd known remained the same. The palace still stood, gleaming, glorious, eternal. Yet inside it, love had been replaced by something colder. Power had changed hands, and the queen of the golden cage now ruled alone. The fall of the empire. It came not to Elara, but to Lord Adrian Vale, delivered by a trembling footman who dared not meet his eyes. The seal was crimson, the handwriting delicate, unmistakably hers. At first Adrian thought it another of her silent wars, another carefully placed barb meant to wound his pride. But when he broke the seal, his breath caught. Inside was not a confession, it was a revelation. Dozens of letters, copies of contracts, names, accounts, all written in her graceful hand, had been sent to the Parliament Inquiry Committee. Evidence of fraud, corruption, coercion, evidence of him. Adrian's empire, built through years of ruthlessness, ambition, and brilliance, now lay at the mercy of the very woman he had sworn to protect and possess. He stared at the papers until his vision blurred, until the words bled into one another. Then, very quietly, he whispered, "Elara." In the east wing, unaware that her letter had arrived, Elara stood before the mirror, fastening her cloak. The dawn was still pale, the air trembling with mist. She had planned everything, the carriages, the servants, the shipment of records she'd sent to London under a false name. This was her last act, the end of the empire and her freedom. But even as she tied the cloak around her shoulders, her hands shook. She could still hear his voice, not the cold lord of the palace, but the man who had once looked at her with something resembling awe. The man who had shown her the stars through the crystal roof of the conservatory and whispered that he'd never known beauty until her. That memory burned now, tender, unwanted, cruelly alive. Why must love be so near to destruction, she thought? Why must it feel like betrayal just to breathe again? The storm came before the sun fully rose. Thunder cracked across the moors, shaking the golden palace like a warning. Adrian burst through the door of her chamber, the letter clutched in his fist. "Elara!" His voice echoed off the marble walls. "What have you done?" She turned slowly, her cloak half fastened, her expression unreadable. "What I should have done, long ago." "You've ruined me," he shouted. "Every contract, every bond, they'll tear me apart. Then they will do only what you did to others." He stared at her, as though seeing her for the first time. "You planned this?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Since the day you tried to make me yours." His voice trembled. "All those nights, the laughter, the trust, was it all a lie?" "No," she said, and that single word cut him deeper than any blade. "That is what makes it hurt." He took a step closer. "You could have left, Elara. You could have gone anywhere. Why this?" She met his gaze, eyes glistening. "Because if I left quietly, you would have built another palace, crushed another soul, claimed another heart. I couldn't let you. Then you destroyed me for the sake of your righteousness." "I destroyed you," she said softly, "because I loved you, and you left me no other way." He froze. Outside, the thunder rolled again, closer now, shaking the glass of the tall windows. For a moment, he looked almost young again, the man beneath the title, stripped of pride and wealth and reason. Then something dark flickered behind his eyes. "You think you've won," he said quietly, "but you've built your freedom on ash." He turned, pacing the length of the room, his hands trembling. "Do you know what happens when the empire falls? When the investors discover what you've done, you won't be free, you'll be hunted. I am not afraid, she whispered. You should be, he said, voice breaking, because I will not survive without you, and I do not intend to die alone. Before she could answer, lightning split the sky. The windows burst open, the wind swept through the room, scattering papers like golden leaves. And somewhere deep in the manor, the fire Adrian had left burning in his study caught the velvet curtains. Within minutes, the palace began to burn. Flames climbed the golden walls like hungry ghosts. The corridors filled with smoke and panic. Servants fled in all directions, the marble floors turned slick with ash and tears. "Ilara!" Adrian called, his voice raw, echoing through the chaos. "Ilara!" She was in the west wing, trying to help a maid escape when he found her. Smoke billowed around them, the ceiling beginning to crack. "You must leave!" she shouted. "The east stairs!" He grabbed her arm. "Not without you!" The heat was unbearable. The firelight flickered over their faces, painting them in gold and ruin. "Adrian, please!" she cried. "It's over!" "No!" His grip tightened. "You said you loved me once." "I did," she said through tears. "And that's why I must let you go." He shook his head, desperate, wild. "I built this for you." "And you buried yourself in it." The ceiling groaned, a beam collapsing in a shower of sparks. Ilara shoved him aside, pulling him toward the hall, her sleeve catching fire. He tore the cloak from her shoulders, extinguishing the flames with his bare hands, cursing under his breath. They stumbled through the smoke together, half-blind, coughing, choking. Every corner of the palace burned, every room that had witnessed their love, their war, their silence. When they reached the grand staircase, the sight stopped them both. The chandelier, the same one under which they had first met, had melted halfway from the ceiling, its crystals dripping molten gold. It crashed down as they watched, splitting the marble floor like the heart of their empire itself. They were trapped. "Ilara!" Adrian's voice was breaking. "Go through the west passage. I'll clear the way. You'll never make it. Neither will you if we stay here." Another explosion shook the hall, the great furnace from below, bursting from heat. Smoke filled the world. In the chaos, Ilara turned to him one last time, her face streaked with ash, her hair falling loose, her eyes bright with tears. "I never meant to destroy you," she said, "only the man you became." He looked at her through the flames and smiled, faintly, tragically. "Then you've succeeded." He pushed her toward the open archway, the one place where the air still moved, just as the ceiling began to give way. "Ilara, run!" she did. She ran through fire and smoke, through the ruins of their golden world, until the cold rain outside struck her face like salvation. Behind her, the palace roared, a dying beast collapsing upon itself. And through the inferno, she saw him, Adrian Vale, standing at the base of the grand hall, surrounded by flame, his figure dark against the blaze. He did not move. "Adrian!" she screamed. But her voice was lost in the fire. By morning, the Palace of Gold was gone. The moors were silent, except for the hiss of steam rising from the ashes. What had once been a monument to love and ambition was now nothing more than blackened stone and twisted iron. Ilara stood among the ruins, cloak torn, her face pale with grief. In her hands she held what little remained, a locket Adrian had given her once, found half melted in the debris. Inside, beneath soot and gold dust, was a miniature of the two of them, painted before everything had gone wrong. He was smiling. She was not. Tears blurred her vision. The wind carried the last scent of smoke away into the hills. "He built me a palace of gold," she whispered, and I turned it into his prison." Her voice trembled, but it was my heart that burned with it. By the week's end, news of Lord Adrian Vale's death spread through the Empire. His fortune vanished. His name was spoken with both awe and pity. The man who had built an empire too magnificent to last. Elara disappeared from public sight. Some said she fled to the countryside. Others claimed she took a new name and devoted her life to rebuilding what his greed had destroyed. But those who had seen her that final morning swore that she stood on the ashes, her eyes turned toward the rising sun, and whispered a prayer for the man she could neither love nor hate entirely. The Golden Palace was gone. But in the ruins, something truer remained. Not glory, not vengeance, but the quiet redemption of a woman who had survived the fire and lived to remember what it cost. Ashes and redemption. The morning after the fire, the moors were quiet except for the hiss of lingering smoke and the soft murmur of wind through blackened trees. The ruins of the Palace of Gold lay in stark contrast to the rising sun, a skeletal monument to ambition, love, and hubris. Ash drifted like snow across the fields, golden and black mingling in strange mournful patterns. Elara stepped carefully over scorched marble and shattered crystal, her cloak tattered, her hands dusted with soot. Her eyes searched through the ruins for any trace of him. At first, there was nothing, only silence, smoke, and the bitter scent of charred wood. Then she heard it. A cough, a groan, a step dragging across debris. "Elara!" The voice was hoarse, strained, but unmistakably his. She ran toward it. Through the haze of smoke, she saw him, Adrian Vale, kneeling amidst the ruins, soot streaking his once perfect face, his clothes singed, a hand pressed to a bleeding cut along his shoulder. The golden palace he had built, the empire he had ruled, had crumbled, leaving him raw and human. "Elara," he whispered again, "you survived." "I always survive," she said softly, kneeling beside him. Her hands shook as she pressed a sleeve against his wound. "But you've been reckless." "I am not afraid," he rasped. "Not of fire, not of ruin, not of you." Her eyes filled. "Adrian, I did this. I destroyed it all." He shook his head. "No, you freed us, freed me, freed yourself. Perhaps we both needed this to see who we truly are." For a long moment, neither spoke. Smoke curled around them, ashes settling like snow upon their hair. "You hated me once," she said quietly, "or something close to it." "And yet I loved you," he said, meeting her gaze. "Even in your rebellion, even in your fire, I loved you." Elara swallowed, her voice trembling. "And I loved you, enough to make you suffer, enough to make us both pay." He reached for her hand, rough and blackened with ash. "We are alive, Elara. That counts for something." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "We are alive, and nothing else is." He squeezed her hand gently. "Nothing else matters now. Not gold, not power, not a palace built to cage hearts. Only this, truth between us, only this moment." They rose together amidst the ruins, dust settling around them, the world silent but for their breaths. For the first time, they looked at each other not as captor and captive, not as ruler and subject, not as builder and muse. They saw two hearts laid bare, tender and scarred, intertwined by love, pride and loss. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt nothing, not the palace, not the empire. They chose instead to live simply among the moors, in a cottage far from the weight of wealth and expectation. The fires of ambition were replaced with quiet mornings and shared labour. Gardens grew where ash had lain, and children's laughter filled the air. Not theirs yet, but someday perhaps. And when people whispered of the Vale Fortune, the Palace of Gold, and the tragic end of its master, Adrian and Elara merely smiled. They no longer needed gold nor grandeur. They had found something far rarer: freedom, forgiveness, and the quiet redemption of hearts once bound by desire and pride. One evening, as the sun set over the moors, Elara and Adrian sat on a hill overlooking the valley. The wind carried the scent of new growth, wildflowers and rain-soaked earth. Elara leaned against him. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The palace, the empire?" He shook his head. "No, only the illusion that we could ever own each other." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps we were never meant to belong to anyone but ourselves and each other." He kissed the top of her head. "Then let this be enough." And in that quiet moment, amid ashes and new life, they understood the truth that had eluded them for years: that love, untamed, cannot be possessed; that freedom, once seized, can coexist with devotion; that sometimes, even in loss and ruin, two hearts can finally be home. The Palace of Gold was gone, but the fire within them, the love, the memory, the redemption, remained eternal.